Okay, so I wanted to chat with you about the other two readings that I assigned this week. The second reading from Mary Waters is actually a chapter from her book called Black Identities. This is a book about West Indian immigrants to the US, and the chapter I selected for you folks is about the second generation because I thought you would be more interested to see how the second generation acculturates to the US. The other reading that you have is from Natasha Wariku, and she writes about the Indo-Caribbeans, also the second generation. Now, I don't want you to be confused here because you are essentially looking at immigrants from more or less the same region in the world, or their parents, the first generation, is from the Caribbean, but you are also looking at two groups of people. So the folks who are in Waters' study are Black immigrants. They would be classified as Black in the US. And the folks in Wariku's study are Indo-Caribbean. So essentially they would be classified as South Asian in the US. Now, if you look at Waters' study on Black immigrants, you find that whites in her study are showing more favorable responses to foreign-born blacks. And what you find ironically is that the more these folks assimilate, they experience downward mobility, which is kind of the opposite of what assimilationists were theorizing about that first group of immigrants, European immigrants, that in order to assimilate, you need to lose your ethnic identity, lose your accent, and then you experience upward mobility. But with this group of folks who are racialized as Black, you see that once they lose their accent, the Caribbean accent, they are just seen as Black Americans, and then they therefore experience downward mobility. They are not treated as well as when they actually had those accents, because that distinguished them from native-born Blacks. I have images here of some well-known Black immigrants, folks who were not born in the United States. And by the Pew Report, we know that a full 9% of Black Americans are immigrants, and this is going to triple or nearly triple by from the 1980s. By 2060, the Census Bureau projects that the number will rise to 16.5%. And so every one in five Black Americans will have been born abroad, not in the US. So it's a significant part of the Black population, and you do see some animosity between foreign-born Blacks and native-born Blacks, where we've noticed that by students reporting it on our own campus at DVC, that sometimes there's that feeling of distancing yourself from native-born Blacks because unfortunately stereotypes about native-born Blacks go global even before immigrants arrive in the United States, thanks to global culture, Hollywood, stereotypes, and so on. West Indians will often retain their ethnic identity and emphasize distinction from Black Americans as a way of avoiding negative stereotypes and creating a sense of superiority over native-born Blacks. So Waters finds in her study three different identity paths, and she surveyed about 83 folks in her study. She finds that a majority of them, so 43%, or the largest group, if not the majority, identify simply as Black Americans once they're in the second generation. And she argues that they develop somewhat of an oppositional identity once this happened. Remember, we talked about oppositional identity in the context of educational inequality, and it's a controversial piece of theorizing because it sometimes puts the blame on folks who are already marginalized. But the second generation in this group, very importantly, often belongs to working class parents and therefore they're living and experiencing some of the same kinds of marginalization that native-born blacks are. In the second group, the folks who identify as ethnic American and not necessarily Black American, they have a strong ethnic identity. They're often middle class, right? They distance themselves from Black Americans. Parents who are middle class in this group have more control over the socialization process of their children, and they often grow up with a sense of being superior to native-born blacks. The third group simply identifies as immigrant. They might see themselves more as Jamaican or Trinidadian, and so they don't as yet have this complex tension between am I ethnic or am I Black American? So they don't necessarily choose a side. What is really interesting about this study is that it critiques earlier models of assimilation, and it shows how important race is as a master status. Once you lose that accent, folks don't necessarily recognize you as belonging to an ethnic group, you simply appear Black. So the paradox of that process is that for Black immigrants, holding on to an ethnic identity is actually to their advantage. For this reason, West Indians are sometimes called the model minority. The structural realities are very different. They come from a nation where they are not the racial minority. That develops a very different sensibility. And so they have a much more positive outlook towards race relations until, of course, you get to the second generation where, unfortunately, the outcomes are pretty depressing because by then you have encountered discrimination, marginalization, economic poverty, etc. So the context of immigration definitely plays a role in our mentality. The immigrant mentality often is we will do whatever it takes, right? Because you have another frame of reference, you're coming from a different context, and you come in with the mindset that I will have to struggle and compromise, right? So the second generation, on the other hand, might have a very different mindset from their first generation immigrant parents. Wariku complicates our conceptual framework by proposing the notion of cosmopolitan ethnic identity, right? And in many ways, she is drawing upon these two studies that I assigned to you from Mary Waters. She is looking, as I said, at second generation Indo-Caribbeans. And then she's looking at what happens to the second generation youth, right? When they have ambiguous racial identity. They don't quite fit into existing ethnic identities. This is a group of folks that's South Asian by race, West Indian by ethnicity, because that's where their parents come from, American by nationality, because they're born in the US, and then in terms of religious affiliation, they could be Hindu, Christian, or Muslim, sometimes within the same family, which is very typical of Indo-Caribbeans and not necessarily Indian families. There are also gender differences in this that we'll look at in a second, but what Wariku observes is that cosmopolitan identity is only possible under these conditions. One is these are folks who come from very multi-ethnic societies thanks to slave trade. In the West Indies, you have populations of African origin. There were indentured servants that were taken from India. So you have folks of Indian origin 6 generations ago. And it was finally abolished in 1833, right? Slavery was, and that's when they started relying more on indentured servitude. So the first thing to notice is they come from very multi-ethnic context. They come into very multi-ethnic context. So Wariku is looking at New York City, where no one group is in majority. There's absence of economic competition in the context that she's looking at, and this is also a group that's not classified as black or white. and that binary remains really important in the US. As I said, there are gender differences. The girls often identified as Indian thanks to the influence of Bollywood, but Bollywood also is often feminized. So the girls were attracted to the clothing and the movies and so on. It created this particular style. And they would often sit and watch movies with their moms who would use it as a way of teaching them so-called Indian values. The boys tended to stay away from this particular style and opted more in favor of hybrid music with influences of calypso, bhangra, etc. Interesting is that for this group, in their secondary relationships is where you see the cosmopolitan identity enacted. They had friends from all different ethnic groups. Although there was some tension between the Indo-Caribbean second generation and second generation Indian immigrants, right? So issues of authenticity, etc. What's interesting is that in their primary relationships, which is their romantic relationships, there's quite a bit of homogeneity still, right? So they're forming those with other Indo-Caribbeans, not as cosmopolitan, right? But definitely the cosmopolitan ethnic identity complicates our understanding of ethnic options because Waters was asserting that non-white folks have no choice in terms of ethnic identity, and Wariku in her study is finding that non-white folks might have some degree of choice in how they express their ethnic identity and how crucial it is under these very specific conditions of racial ambiguity and very multicultural context, both the context which they're coming from as well as coming into. And under those very specific conditions, people of color may have certain options in terms of asserting an ethnic identity.